There is an identity so widely claimed that it has become almost invisible as a claim. Tens of millions of Americans describe themselves as Irish. Millions more claim Scottish ancestry, Welsh ancestry, the broader Celtic heritage that stretches from the Atlantic coast of Ireland to the highlands of Scotland to the mountains of Wales and Brittany. St. Patrick's Day is the most widely celebrated ethnic holiday in the United States. The Celtic identity is woven into the fabric of American culture so completely that it rarely occurs to anyone to ask what it actually means. Where did the Celts come from? Who were they in the biological sense? And are the people who carry that identity today actually descended from the people who built Stonehenge, who carved the great passage tombs of the Irish Boyne Valley, who resisted the Roman legions in the mountains of Caledonia? The answer that ancient DNA has produced over the past decade is one of the most disorienting findings in the history of European archaeology, because the Celts, as a genetic reality, never quite existed in the way the story requires. And what was actually there, before the story was written, is stranger and older and more layered than anything the identity claims had room for. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the conventional picture looked like before the genetics arrived. The Celts, in the textbook version, were an Iron Age people whose origin lay in Central Europe, in the Hallstatt and Latin cultures of what is today Austria and Switzerland, roughly between 800 and 400 BCE. From that Central European homeland, the argument went, Celtic-speaking peoples spread outward in every direction, carrying their languages, their art styles, their religious practices, and their warrior culture across Western Europe, into Iberia, into Gaul, into Britain, into Ireland, and eventually, under pressure from Roman expansion and Germanic migrations, retreating to the Atlantic fringe where their languages and cultures survived in the places Rome never fully absorbed. It was a tidy model. Migration from a core homeland, expansion, contraction, survival at the edges. Celtic identity as a coherent ethnic and cultural package that moved together across the landscape. It was also, as the genetics would eventually demonstrate, significantly wrong. The first challenge came not from DNA, but from linguistics. By the 1990s, a growing number of scholars had begun to question whether the Central European origin model for Celtic languages actually held up. The linguistic evidence, examined carefully, suggested that Celtic languages might have developed not in the Hallstatt heartland, but along the Atlantic coast itself. In a maritime cultural zone stretching from Iberia through Brittany and into the British Isles. The bell beaker culture, a widespread Bronze Age phenomenon that had spread along the Atlantic facade of Europe between roughly 2800 and 1800 BCE, was proposed as a more likely vehicle for Celtic language spread than the Iron Age Hallstatt culture. This was a significant academic debate. It remained, for years, a debate about linguistics and archaeology, a question that the available evidence could not definitively resolve. Then the ancient DNA arrived and made everything considerably more complicated. Beginning around 2015 and accelerating through the following decade, researchers extracted and sequenced genomes from hundreds of prehistoric individuals buried across Britain and Ireland, spanning a period from the Mesolithic through the Iron Age and beyond. What they found rewrote the population history of the British Isles from the ground up. The oldest inhabitants of Britain and Ireland for whom we have genetic data were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, a population with genetic affinities to other Western European hunter-gatherers of the same period, dark-skinned, dark-eyed. Adapted to a post-glacial landscape that looked almost nothing like modern Britain. These people lived in the islands for thousands of years. And then, around 4000 BCE, they were almost entirely replaced. The replacement was driven by the arrival of Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, the same westward-moving agricultural population whose genetic descendants show up across most of Neolithic Europe. In Britain and Ireland, the replacement was strikingly complete. Within a few centuries of the farmers' arrival, the genetic signature of the earlier hunter-gatherers had been reduced to a tiny fraction of the overall population ancestry. The people who built Stonehenge, who raised the great megalithic monuments of Neolithic Britain and Ireland, who constructed the passage tomb at Newgrange in the Boyne Valley, were primarily descended from these Anatolian Neolithic farmers, not from the earlier indigenous population, and then around 2500 BCE they were replaced again. The Bell-Beaker migration brought a massive influx of ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the same pastoralist population whose westward expansion reshaped the genetics of most of Europe during the same period. In Britain, the genetic impact of this migration was extraordinary, even by the standards of a continent being transformed. Within a few generations of the Beaker people's arrival, steppe-related ancestry came to account for roughly 90% of the ancestry of people living in Britain. The scale of this replacement is almost without parallel in the ancient DNA record for any region of comparable size. The Neolithic farming population that had built Stonehenge, that had raised the great stone circles and long barrows and earthwork enclosures of prehistoric Britain, was genetically replaced almost as completely as the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers before them had been replaced by the farmers. The monuments remained. The people who built them were gone, or nearly so, absorbed into the incoming population at levels so low that their genetic contribution to later British populations became effectively invisible without careful analysis. Britain had been remade, biologically, twice before the Iron Age had even begun, and the people who arrived with the Bell-Beaker culture brought with them not only new genetics, but almost certainly new languages. The Proto-Indo-European derived tongues whose descendants would eventually give rise to every language spoken in the British Isles today, including, most likely, the Celtic languages themselves. This is the finding that changes everything. Because here is what it means for Celtic identity. When the Iron Age arrived in Britain and Ireland, the population that was there to receive it, the population that would eventually be described by Roman writers as Celts, that population was already 3 genetic layers deep. Hunter-gatherer ancestry compressed to a trace, Neolithic farmer ancestry reduced but still present, and a dominant layer of steppe pastoralist ancestry that had arrived with the Bell-Beaker people and had, over the course of the Bronze Age, come to define the genetic character of the islands. The people the Romans called Britons and fought at Hadrian's Wall, the people who painted themselves blue and terrified Julius Caesar's legions, the people whose descendants today claim Celtic identity at every St. Patrick's Day parade in Boston and Chicago and New York. Those people were, in their deepest genetic roots, largely descended from steppe pastoralists who had arrived from the Eurasian grasslands 1,500 years before the Iron Age began. They were not, in any meaningful genetic sense, a Celtic people who had migrated from Central Europe. They were a Bronze Age population that had been in the islands for over 1,000 years before Celtic languages and Celtic art styles arrived, and that adopted those cultural elements without, in most cases, being replaced by a new population bringing them. The language came, but the people were already there. This is the twist that reconfigures the entire picture. Celtic identity, as it is understood today, and as it has been understood for centuries, is primarily a cultural inheritance, not a genetic one. The languages, the art, the mythology, the spiritual practices that define Celtic culture arrived in Britain and Ireland as a cultural package, probably spread along the Atlantic trade networks that had connected these communities for millennia, and were adopted by a population that was genetically the product of processes that had nothing to do with anything anyone would recognize as Celtic. The Irish, by this analysis, are not simply the descendants of Celtic people who migrated from the continent. They are the descendants of Bronze Age steppe pastoralists who lived in Ireland for 1,000 years before Celtic culture reached them, and who then adopted that culture so completely that the earlier identity was essentially overwritten in the historical record. What the genetics recovered, in those ancient burials across Britain and Ireland, was the population that existed before the overwriting, and that population tells a story that the identity claims had never anticipated. There is a burial at Newgrange in Ireland that encapsulates this complexity in a single grave. Among the individuals buried in the Great Neolithic Passage tomb, one individual showed signs of first-degree incest, a pattern associated in ancient societies with the kind of ritual kingship practiced by a ruling elite that believed divine status was maintained through bloodline purity. This person, buried in one of the most extraordinary Neolithic monuments ever constructed in the ancient world, a structure aligned with the winter solstice sunrise, so precisely that it had to have been planned across generations, lived and died 1,000 years before Celtic culture arrived in Ireland. He or she was part of a society whose astronomical knowledge, whose architectural ambition, whose social complexity the Celtic period would eventually inherit, but did not create and cannot claim. The people who built Newgrange were not Celtic. They were the Neolithic farmers whose descendants were then largely displaced by the Bell Beaker steppe migration. The Celts arrived in Ireland to find Newgrange already standing, already ancient, already the object of reverence for a population that had itself forgotten who built it. That passage tomb was old when Celtic Ireland was young. And yet it is Celtic mythology that survived to be written down, Celtic names that attach themselves to the landscape, Celtic identity that the descendants of all those earlier populations eventually claimed as their own. The Celts did not build Newgrange. They arrived to find it already a ruin of someone else's world. The question this raises is the same question that the Phoenician data raised, the same question the Etruscan data raised, the same question that the genetics of every population eventually forces onto the table. What is an identity, really, when the genetics tell a different story than the name? The answer the data consistently returns is that identity is a choice made by communities across generations, a decision about which stories to tell about the past, which ancestors to claim, which cultural thread to follow forward. The genetics do not invalidate those choices. They simply reveal that the choices were always more complicated, the origins always more layered, than the clean stories we tell about ourselves ever had room to acknowledge. The Celts were never simply who we thought they were. And neither, it turns out, are the tens of millions of people who carry that identity today. They are something older and more complex and more interesting than a single migration story can contain. They are, like every human population that has ever existed, the product of processes that began long before anyone thought to give them a name.